Today we are once again diving into the Canon R5 Mark II. We will take a closer look at the camera's video recording capabilities and examine what have changed in terms of image quality, color reproduction, noise performance, dynamic range and rolling shutter compared to the R5, the old R5 and the R5C. And let me tell you, this wasn't easy. I've never done as many test shots and comparisons in my life as I did for this video. So buckle up, it's going to be pretty nerdy, but also I think quite interesting. And with some things that I absolutely didn't expect. So let's get started. I'm David, you are watching The Vision and let's go. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the bell, and feel free to check out my Instagram as well. The Canon R5 was an impressive camera for me, introducing many new video features to mirrorless cameras overall. 4K 60 FPS from the whole sensor, or even 4K 120 FPS from the entire image sensor without cropping was unheard of before. And 8K video recording also. And the quite brilliant 8K downsampling to 4K HQ was also unheard of before. However, there were some compromises in terms of image quality. For example, I didn't enjoy 4K 60 or 4K 120 much, because as soon as there were shadows in the frame or the light wasn't perfect, the excessive image noise overshadowed, get it, everything else. Additionally, you had no choice aside from C-Log 1 and C-Log 3, neither of which was optimal for low light and noise performance. My preferred mode with this camera was 4K HQ at 24 FPS, and the image quality that came out of this camera was excellent. I switched to the R5C mainly because it addressed the issues that I had with the R5. The 4K 60 was also oversampled from 8K from the entire sensor, had much less noise and was significantly more detailed. However, you were no longer limited to C-Log 3, but could shoot directly in wide DR or later Canon 709, which brought significant advantages in low light and noise performance. But for this comparison, we will stick to C-Log 3, so all cameras keep the same settings consistent. When shooting 8K at 24 FPS, the video from the original R5 is surprisingly the sharpest in my opinion. Even at a totally out of this world 400% zoom, fine detail and textures is still visible, that you can't see with the other two cameras. However, I suspect the R5 is applying more sharpening than the others. And that's not what you always want, which is evident when you compare it to the R5C, which has the same sensor, but the image is much more pleasing. Not as sharp, not as crisp, but you can add this in post. And the details, they are still there in the R5C, but not over sharpened. True, the R5C had much less noise in the shadows. It's also noticeable that the natural gray on my test chart looks more reddish on the R5, whereas it appears more gray on the R5C. In a direct comparison, the R5 II falls short here in 8K video. The 8K video from the new model is less sharp than the others, even though all three cameras focused on the image center of the chart using autofocus. Some of what the R5 II lacks can likely be recovered through sharpening applied afterwards, but not all of this. But this is also a 400% zoom from the video image. However, there are two advantages for the R5 II. First, the 8K footage from the R5 II has significantly less noise than the other two cameras, making the darker areas of the image appear much clearer and more pleasant. Perhaps the effective noise reduction is what causes the slightly lower detail sharpness, but the much better noise performance. Unfortunately, it seems that these slight differences are lost in YouTube's compression overall. The next advantage is visible in all other recordings as well. Despite using the same white balance at 5600 Kelvin, the R5 II is much closer to a true neutral gray than the R5. The color reproduction of the R5 was much more red and had a magenta cast, and that's not here with the R5 II. But for me, more important than 8K is 4K HQ, or now it's called 4K fine up to 30 FPS. This is the 4K mode that actually reads out the whole sensor at 8K but then processes it into a 4K video with great detail and really good noise performance. Here I see a clear advantage for the R5 II in a direct comparison. In terms of details, there's no noticeable difference between the three cameras. All show similarly good image sharpness at 300%. However, the R5 II's big advantage is again the lower noise floor in the darker areas of the test chart. The R5C is already much better than the old R5 in this regard, but the R5 II shows almost no noise in the dark areas or regions of the image. The good noise performance is something that runs through virtually every image mode tested on the R5 II, at least for the lower ISOs. And as mentioned earlier, I often avoided using 4K 60 or 4K 120 with the old R5 for exact these reasons. The R5C on the other hand was completely different. The 4K 60 was also read out from the entire sensor, just like the 4K 24, which is impressively considering that it doesn't have a stacked sensor. This resulted in a significantly better image quality for 4K 60 with the R5C compared to that what the original R5 delivered. The HQ mode was also available for 4K 60 in the R5C. It's not called like this, but it's at the end the same thing. Along with the much better noise performance and noise suppression of the cinema line. Unfortunately, the R5 II lacks exactly what made the R5C so great. There's no 4K 60 downsampling from 8K in the R5 II, even though Canon seemed unsure about this at first, and there are even press releases that mention it, and it was even written on Canon's announcement post. This feature unfortunately didn't make it into the production version of the R5 II. Wherever you like it or not, that's the reality, and we will have to see if a firmware update or something similar changes this in the future. I doubt it, given the overheating behavior of the sensor. The question now is wherever the 4K 60 video present in the camera is better than the one of the old R5. It won't be better than the R5C. So much should be clear to anyone. From my perspective, there's a significant and noticeable improvement in the 4K 60 quality. In the unzoomed view, even the old R5 looks fine. But when you zoom in, it becomes clear, compared R5 II to R5C, that the R5 II is much softer, which was expected. However, when zoomed in and compared with the old R5, not only is there a noticeable difference in noise performance here as well, but there's also less aliasing at the edges of the pie slice or the number 8. This indicates to me that the camera is reading out the image better, or at least it's better interpolating, or it has a better filter over the sensor. And this is resulting in better sharpness at 4K 60 FPS, even without the downsampling. Additionally, in my opinion, the R5 II even outperforms the R5C in terms of noise in the flat areas and shadows. And this is where it starts to get fun. But we will take a closer look at the ISO performance shortly. Also, maybe you can't see this due to the YouTube compression, but that's what I have seen with the original material in my DaVinci Resolve windows. The R5 II also has another trick up its sleeve for 4K 60 FPS, the new SRAW 4K 60 FPS mode. This is a RAW mode that isn't read out from the entire sensor but uses line skipping, meaning every other line and every other pixel of the line is roughly skipped, resulting in a 4K video instead of 8K video, while still showing sensor's raw data. This allows the R5 II to record 4K 60 FPS without causing extreme heat buildup on the sensor, like with the 8K 60. The trade-off is slightly worse noise performance, since the raw data isn't processed by the camera's processor. However, the raw material is also sharper. In the end, it's a 444 subsampling, or better, a pixel-accurate raw readout, which is then to be interpreted by debayering in your NLE. And as a result, the 4K 60 FPS SRAW provides significantly better image sharpness than the normal already processed 4K 60 FPS mode, which appears very soft in comparison but has better noise performance. Another advantage of SRAW is that its data rates are relatively low compared to full RAW. In RAW light mode, 840 Mbit is less than what the R5 II records in some compressed modes with HEVC. The R5 already offered 4K at 120 FPS, but the problem was that the issue I seen in 4K 60 was even more pronounced at 4K 120. To accelerate the readout speed, too many corners were cut. So while 4K 120 in the R5 was nice to have, it was after all the first full frame camera to do so, it didn't necessarily look great and had significant noise issues, which the R5C at least managed better. Compared to the R5 II, both of the older models seem quite outdated. The R5 II is more detailed at 4K 120, it shows less aliasing at edges, and as in every other mode, it shows significantly less noise. The R5 II can also read out the entire sensor at 60 FPS. Not as 4K 60 with downsampling like in the R5C, but at 8K 60 FPS RAW, which is pretty wild considering that the R5 II can do this without needing an external power source, unlike the R5C does. The R5 II can do this just with a battery. Initially, you might think it's odd that the camera can do 8K 60 RAW but not compressed or downsampled. Isn't RAW much harder on the camera? Yes and no. RAW readout is obviously tough on the sensor, which is why it gets so hot and which is why the R5 II shuts down quickly in this mode. But for the processor, RAW isn't that demanding. It has little to do and just passes the video files directly to the memory card. If the video compression to HEVC or even downsampling were added on top of it would produce even more heat since the processor has to do much more. At least that's my understanding for observing cameras over the years. So 8K 60 works only in RAW, but as I said, it works just fine with a battery, without needing a power bank, a V-mount battery or a DC coupler. But how does it look compared to the 8K 60 RAW from the R5C? And here I have to say I'm firmly in the R5 Mark II camp. The R5C shows noticeable aliasing at the edges, which the R5 II doesn't. In terms of details, the R5C has slight advantages at 400% zoom. But again, there's the noise issue. That's more in the R5C. Even the RAW from the R5 II has significantly less noise than that from the R5C, making for a substantial and visible difference at lower ISOs. I have to say this, you see later why. Canon also highlighted the 2K fine mode during the presentation, where a 4K video is oversampled to deliver better Full HD material. This works up to 60 FPS and many people who record longer videos need to manage great data volumes and times were pleased with this feature. The R5C, on the other hand, even had 8K downsampling to Full HD or DCI 2K and the quality was unmatched so far. Better Full HD wasn't available anywhere else. In terms of detail and image sharpness, the 2K fine mode on the R5 II brings almost nothing. The 2K fine from the R5 II isn't really distinguishable from the Full HD from the old R5. That's sad. The only visible improvement is the noise in almost all modes. But compared to the R5C with its DCI 2K recording, both look very, very poor. So unfortunately, 2K fine is more of a paper tiger than a real advantage for those who rely on the Full HD recording for filming. To sum it up, there are quite a few points in favor of the new R5 II. Particularly much more usable 4K 60 and 4K 120 quality, and especially better noise performance, at least at the base ISO 800 and C-Log 3, which we will examine closer next. I preferred using my R5 in 4K HQ mode at ISO 800 or lower, because it was the most predictable. The image quality was great and the noise remained manageable even at C-Log 3. With everything else, I eventually left feeling unsatisfied, as can be seen here when climbing the ISO ladder with 4K 60 FPS from the old R5. With the R5 and R5C, it was crucial to know where the both base ISOs of the dual gain sensor were located. Canon communicated this openly for the R5C, but for the R5, we had to know it, and it was best to avoid ISO 2000 and 2500 because the second circuit was activated when switching to ISO 3200. And the image suddenly became significantly less noisy, as if it's by magic. The R5 II also has this trick up its sleeve. but the behavior is different. The upper base ISO has been shifted by 1/3 of a stop up. In C-Log 2 and C-Log 3, this means the lower base ISO is 800 and the upper is 4000. In Canon 709, it's 400 and 2000. This could actually be an advantage because it makes higher ISOs look better. But however, the push and the advantage that the second circuit gives you with the R5 II is unfortunately not as significant as with the R5, which has basically same noise performance at 800 and 3200. In practice, the R5 Mark II is more challenging at high ISOs compared to the old R5, and it's clearly worse than the R5C. While there are still advantages for the R5 II at ISO 800 and 1600, as mentioned regarding the image quality, things look completely different at 3200. The R5 is already on the second circuit, the R5 II isn't yet. And at 6400, the advantage of switching at 4000 is already gone, and there's more noise here than with the R5. There's just one higher ISO where the R5 II looks better than the older ones, and that's exactly at ISO 4000. Compared to the R5C, the R5 II looks almost laughably bad at every ISO except 800 and 1600. The advantage of the R5C is that it doesn't have to be C-Log. When you shoot in a scene where you want low light, you can switch to Canon 709 or wide DR, which generally has less image noise because it isn't log. The R5C on the other hand is almost a low light miracle and still looks surprisingly clean up to 12,800, while the R5 II shows a lot of noise there. And even when you compare the old R5 with C-Log 3 to the R5 II in the less noisy Canon 709 color profile, you see advantages for the R5 II at ISO 800 and 1600. At ISO 3200, both are already on the second circuit and they look almost identical. Above ISO 6400, the old R5 pulls ahead again. Unfortunately, it doesn't matter where you compare it with HQ, with 4K 60 or with 4K 120. Up to ISO 1600, I consistently see an advantage for the R5 II over the R5. But beyond that, except for ISO 4000, not anymore. Comparing it with the R5C, it's more challenging. The R5 Mark II suppresses the noise better at the lower ISOs, but the R5C has a consistently pleasant grain overall, even up to 12,800 or 25,600. Additionally, with 4K 60, the R5C has enormous advantages in image quality and the noise performance due to the downsampling that it used to read out the whole sensor. Where the R5 II has a significant advantage over the other two cameras is the dynamic range in video. This isn't due to exceptionally good dynamic range from the sensor, but rather because Canon's noise reduction works very well at the base ISOs for video, and the R5 II is the first consumer Canon to have C-Log 2 on board. Those that are familiar with the cinema line like C70 and other cameras will appreciate this. Many wished for C-Log 2 and the R5C, but it still just had C-Log 3, just like the old R5. They said it wasn't possible with the sensor, but I doubt it. Unfortunately, the curve for C-Log 3 doesn't allow as much for dynamic range, especially in the shadows and the shadow recovery in video, compared to C-Log 2. But what do I mean with that? Well, take a look at these two shots. Both were shot with only 2 stops of underexposure, both with the R5 Mark II. One with Canon Log 2 and the other with Canon Log 3. Now see what happens when I try to correct the underexposure in post. The C-Log 3 video completely falls apart. There's just nothing left in the shadows, and so no information can be recovered, and it's just pushing the black to gray. It's simply a much worse dynamic range. Not because the sensor is worse, it's the same camera overall, but because the log curve just doesn't allow for it. The difference becomes more pronounced with 3 stops of underexposure. On the other hand, Canon Log 2 is somewhat worse when it comes to preserving overexposed highlights. If you try to recover 2 stops of overexposure, it works better with C-Log 3 and the image remains crispier and more contrasty. Even if Canon says in the highlights, Canon Log 2 and Canon Log 3 should be the same. I didn't notice significant differences in terms of flexibility and dynamic range among the three cameras when comparing them. The difference mainly comes from the lock curve used, which is why the R5C and the R5 falls apart compared to the R5 Mark II, which can use C-Lock 2. And I guess if the older cameras had C-Lock 2, they would be better than the R5 II here, since they have a much better noise performance. However, the greatest flexibility in pushing the image to the one or the other side is available when shooting RAW video on all three cameras. Overexposure can be best corrected or recovered, but when it comes to pulling up underexposure, I prefer Canon's Canon Log 2 over RAW. Having Canon Log 2 is more or less a game changer for me in this camera. It could be roughly said that Canon Log 2 is better suited for darker shots and Canon Log 3 might be better suited for scenes with more highlights and sunlight. It's my guess, but I would stick to using C-Log 2 for outdoor shoots in high dynamic range scenes, so to have the better flexibility in post in the shadow areas. Now let's take a closer look at rolling shutter performance of these cameras. The R5 Mark II features a fast stacked image sensor, which theoretically should minimize or even eliminate rolling shutter distortions, even during fast movements. However, here's where the camera shows some quite interesting facts. With Canon, having a stacked sensor in video mode doesn't necessarily mean it utilized the stacked sensor with all of its speed. And this is different from what I'm used to with cameras like an Alpha 1, Z9, Z8. And how does this manifest? Let's look at this chart that Excel generated from my 24 FPS video measurements for rolling shutter. Don't mind that it doesn't start at 0, that's an annoying Excel bug. But you will see that the R5 Mark II is the only camera with a stacked sensor here, and it's on the wrong end of the chart. Yes, the R5 Mark II reads out the sensor significantly slower when using the full sensor at 8K, 4K fine or 8K raw than both the R5C and the older R5. How is this even possible? The stacked sensor in the R5 Mark II is slower in video mode than the non-stacked sensors in the R5 and R5C. It sounds really strange, but yes, that's exactly the case, and I find that somewhat frustrating. The reason behind this is likely related to the heat management. If you don't need it, why would you use it? So it can read out slower and so less heat is produced. But that said, even the 17 milliseconds is still pretty fast as a readout time from 8K. Almost fast enough to capture 60 frames per second in this resolution, which requires at least 16.6 milliseconds or less. In practice, the rolling shutter effect on the R5 Mark II is noticeably stronger in my fan test shots than with the R5 or R5C. However, when panning with, say, a telezoom lens from a video tripod head, these differences become barely noticeable at all. But that was an apples to apples comparison. All three cameras were using RAW or log recording, reading out the sensor with maximum color depth. As you might know, camera sensors can be read out faster when you don't need the maximum color depth. If you now limit the comparison to Canon 709 CP1 color profile on the R5 II, the table turns completely. Then the R5 Mark II is now reading out significantly faster than the other two cameras, where it was previously slower. On the R5C, it doesn't matter wherever you use log or Canon 709. Readout is always the same. And the R5 and R6 II doesn't have a color profile. If you don't use log on these cameras, the readout drops to 8-bit color depth instead of 10-bit. But it's striking that the R5 Mark II sensor can read out faster or slower depending on what you choose and need. This naturally makes me wonder if overheating behaves differently when recording log versus Canon 709. We will see. What's also striking is that the R5 Mark II with Canon 709 as a color profile is fast enough, in theory, to read out 4K 60 downsampled from 8K 60 from the full sensor, without maybe generating the same heat as with 8K 60 RAW or log recordings. This gives me some hope that 4K 60 downsampling could be made possible with a few tweaks in a future firmware update, without the camera melting itself. I recall a conversation during the camera's presentation in Munich when someone from Canon asked me if I had tried 4K fine 60 FPS, the downsampled mode, in a different color profile. As I mentioned, they were not entirely sure what the camera could do with the final firmware. I now have some hope after being somewhat disappointed by the overheating result for 8K 60. But of course, we are not just talking about 24 FPS videos. For 60 FPS videos, you need a readout time of less than 16.6 milliseconds, and in 4K 60 FPS, the R5 II is faster, even with lock, than any of the older cameras that can do this. Additionally, the 8K 60 FPS RAW mode is significantly faster than the R5C's 8K 60 RAW mode and the 4K 60 downsampling. By the way, 4K 60 in SRAW isn't as fast as 4K 60 log in this case, but it's as fast at 8K 60 RAW from the full sensor. Little bit strange, but again, in 4K 60 you can also increase the readout speed further by switching from log to Canon 709. 7.2 milliseconds is very, very good here. At 4K with 120 FPS, it no longer makes a difference for the R5 II, wherever if you use log or Canon 709, both are really fast at 7.2 milliseconds with 4K 120. And another important aspect for me in this test was the color reproduction of the R5 Mark II in video mode. As much as I love Canon colors, I was reluctant to use the video material from the first R5 without further tweaks or without a completely measured white balance. To me, it simply has a noticeable magenta cast that needed to be corrected before moving forward. This wasn't just overly warm color reproduction that can be tweaked by adjusting the Kelvin value, it simply was a color cast when you set the camera to one of its preset Kelvin values. You can even see the difference in RAW with identical settings afterwards. In contrast, the R5C was a revelation in terms of color reproduction. It just looked much better, even though the sensor is identical. The R5C does what Canon always is praised for. It was producing beautiful rendered skin tones. But sometimes I could use a little bit more saturation in these skin tones. My main interest was in how well the R5 Mark II performs compared to the R5C. And I think it does remarkably well. In a direct comparison of C-Log 3 material with these shots, with the same settings, my ranking would now clearly be R5 Mark II at the top. It has that extra bit of saturation in the skin tones that I was sometimes missing with the R5C, but it's far, far, far away from the magenta cast and the unwanted warmth of the old R5. The R5C and the R5 Mark II are very close in comparison, but I would prefer the R5 Mark II's image because it's more pleasing for me. It's also nice that there are no obvious differences in color reproduction between Canon Log 2, Canon Log 3 or Canon 709 after applying Canon's official LUTs. With Canon Log and Canon Log 3 on the old R5 it was like night and day difference in color reproduction. So let's summarize what I've learned about the R5 Mark II from this test and what I can take away, either for your purchasing decision or for using your R5 Mark II. In terms of image quality, the R5 Mark II surpasses the old R5 in almost every way. More detailed images, better resolution, less aliasing, and especially at ISO 800 and 1600 and significantly better noise performance across the frame rates. Just a better image quality after all. A major plus from the R5 Mark II over the R5 is its versatility, as you are no longer forced to use C-Log and can also record in the even less noisy Canon 709 with 10-bit color depth in every codec you want. And there's also the SRAW video mode, which I've come to appreciate over the past few weeks with the camera. Sometimes you want RAW, you want maybe the little bit better sharpness of the SRAW over the 4K 60, but you don't want to shoot in 8K. And when it comes to noise performance at higher ISOs, the R5 Mark II was tough. It was a tough time. 800, 1600 is clearly better than the old R5, but beyond that it gets very challenging. The new higher base ISO of 2000 or 4000 was not a strong step as it was with the R5 and R5C. At 6400 and above, the R5 Mark II significantly lags behind the older R5 and R5C. I didn't expect this, but at least not to this extent. It was a little bit disappointing for me, since in photo mode I haven't seen any difference in the noise performance between these cameras. What really impressed me however, is the dynamic range and the flexibility of the video files thanks to the implementation of Canon Log 2 here. It is a difference of night and day. It allows for significantly better shadow recovery than with the R5 or R5C that you could ever dream of. Canon Log 3 on the other hand seems to have more potential for preserving highlights in the R5 Mark II, but I will likely shoot Canon Log 2 for most outdoor scenes with high dynamic range. I expose for the highlights and know I have more dynamic range to play with in the shadows. The rolling shutter performance of the R5 Mark II in video mode is clearly worse than, for example, what a Nikon Z8 does. That readout in any mode is less than 10 milliseconds, but the readout times are still not problematic. In practice, you hardly notice any distortion at all. Canon likely reads out the sensor slower in video mode to keep the heat production in check. What's particularly interesting is that log or RAW recordings from the full sensor are actually slower than with the older R5 or R5C. I didn't expect that, and I've sent a query to Canon to ask if that's right, but this seems to be intentionally. And that was also quite surprising to me, like the next fact. Switching from Canon log to Canon 709 is noticeably speeding up the sensor readout to the point that downsampled 4K60 from the full sensor would be theoretically possible with 10-bit color depth. At higher frame rates, the R5 Mark II sensor readout time is always better than the older cameras. Color reproduction was a big topic I was very interested in, and it's another big plus for the R5 Mark II. In terms of video color reproduction, it's on par or not slightly better than the R5C. Personally, I prefer the R5 Mark II over the R5C. And it's worlds better than how the same settings look out of the R5, the original old R5. And the latter always required some tweaking through measured white balance and post-processing for skin tones. That's no longer the case with the R5 Mark II. Overall, the R5 Mark II is very impressive in video mode and represents a clear improvement over the old R5. As it should be. The high ISO noise performance is the biggest weakness for me, along with the lack of 4K60 downsampling. But all in all, it's enough for me to sell my R5C with its poor battery life, with the micro HDMI port and the comparatively low inferior video autofocus. But let me know what you think of the results from my video deep dive. Feel free to leave a comment or check out the Discord server, but it's mostly in German. If the R5 Mark II is something you are interested in, you will find links to purchasing the camera under the video in the video description. And by buying through these links, you can support this channel for free and help me continue making videos like this one. If you liked the video, remember to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and what should you do? Yeah, you should hit the bell so you don't miss any future videos. And here are some more videos you can check out after this one, because that's it for today from DIDN in English, and I will have to say goodbye till next time.